So this is communitysocialprofiles.com. You can click on the map and you can go anywhere in Australia and you can see who lives in that circle. So I've clicked around just south of here, around Guildford area. And if you wanted to plant a church and you're wondering what is it like in that area, you can get just a first look at some stats here. So if I click in another area, I'm clicking on the middle of Lidcombe now. I've now got a 5-kilometre radius around that area, and it immediately tells me 221,000 people live in that circle, around 5 kilometres around Lidcombe. So that's stretching to just where we are on the edge of Parramatta. It tells me how many households. That's how many leaflets I need if I'm going to do a drop. If you want to do a 1 kilometre circle around your church, go find your church on the map, type in 1 kilometre here. Okay, we need 4,500 leaflets. So, you know, and this is very exact. The building blocks that that the census use, the smallest ones are a couple of blocks of houses. They're called SA1s, and you can get those, but they're pretty hard to work with unless you've got good software. And as I mentioned, an IT genius who's worked for us for many years, we've looked at what these very expensive packages can do that are really unaffordable. You're talking tens of thousands of dollars of software. And we said, we just want that. We want to be able to pick any address in Australia, draw any size circle around it, and find who lives in that circle. And he was able to build that using the building blocks that we had. So can I just encourage you to check out communitysocialprofiles.com when you get a chance. That's the slide I'm looking for. So who lives in your area? That's just something we're very proud of that we have spent years developing. We've been sending this out to churches in the past and without them paying for it and saying, pay for it if you want to keep it, send it back if you don't. We don't do that anymore. We send it electronically if it's ordered. You'll get it in 2 days if you order this. You get that map stuff that I just showed you for nothing. I've probably taken your afternoon off you now. You'll go away. I've mentioned this to a few people and they say, well, there goes my afternoon. I'm going to be clicking through the western suburbs of Sydney and watching the stats change as I move around. Or I'm going to be clicking in, this area here where we're thinking about planting a church. So I encourage you to look at that and have fun with that. But if you want the full set of stats, then you can get a report and it'll take about 2 days. It'll come electronically. If you don't have a good printer, we can mail you a hard copy too for an extra $10. But it's a fantastic report. Some of you already know about it, and you've done bulk orders for your denominations, which is cheaper as well. But I would encourage you to look at that. So, folks, I mentioned at the beginning of our time the denominations that are here, and this is a list of the denominations that we've worked with over the years. Every time we run the National Church Life Survey, we have at least 20 denominations take part, and some of the denominations on that list didn't exist when the NCLS started. So we're working with a changing country, and of course some of those denominations have changed a lot. Some of them have given birth to other groups, so that's our history. What I want to do in this time that we have remaining today is talk about our purpose, some practical issues, and some outcomes. Because we actually exist to serve different groups, and this is one of these beautiful moments where we have different people in the room. We want to serve the nation, and we want to have authoritative data about what's going on for the church. That's where Ruth's last session came from. We want to talk to denominations, either at a state or regional level or national. We want to bless local churches with some evidence to guide their thinking. We want to bless local leaders, and we work with not just our own research team, but we work with associate researchers as well. So some of you here represent colleges today or work in partnership with colleges. Get in touch with us about the data that we have. We have some exciting stuff, and we enter into agreements with groups even overseas who want to produce papers, PhD students or other researchers. We exist to live in partnership with our denominations. If we don't continue a good partnership, then we won't be an NCLS anymore, will we? That's part of our definition of who we are. So that's very important for us that we have a good partnership. We exist to produce evidence to help with planning and decision making, and this isn't evidence that overrides everything, that eclipses everything. We expect church leaders to take on what's going on in your churches and combine that prayerfully with what is our calling as a church, which we can't tell you, and what do we know about our local context outside of our churches. So it's a process that you need to combine this, but we want to help you with the NCLS work with what's going on. We'll just tell you what's going on. We want to turn it into useful resources, and we do this ultimately to nurture life and health in churches and church leaders. So I want to spend about 2 minutes telling you what's going to happen in our lives. We look all right today, Ruth, but have a look at us in 18 months, and we'll have to scrub ourselves up a bit better, I think, because the next 18 months are going to be really busy time for us. We're starting to enter into this time of preparing. So in 18 months' time, we're going to have new surveys. They're pictures of paper forms. We're going to have online surveys as well. And there'd be too many to list there because they will vary depending on denominations. But there's just a nice picture of some survey forms there. But the process that it takes to get there is consultation with you guys, okay? We want to be your mission researchers, your research team, and we can only do that in partnership. So what will happen is we'll go through a process of ordering and completing surveys. Churches will spend time in up to 10 different languages that we currently have. Tell us your new language if you've got a new group. Last time it was Burmese people, and especially the Baptists in Victoria who are doing an incredible job with Burmese churches and some of their biggest churches. And so, okay, let's do a Burmese translation. How does that work? Well, there's several groups actually, so we ended up doing 2 translations just to cover that group. And the time before that, it was Sudanese people. We did a Dinka translation. So what is it this time that will be important for us to do? We want to know that. There'll be that time in church, and there may well be an online version that involves less time in church or no time in church. Then we'll be having thousands of forms come back to us, which we scan and enter. And I mention that because if you've been following NCLS for a long time, you will have noticed that the time that it takes for churches to get their results has dropped dramatically. Back in the 90s, it took over a year for churches to get their results, and starting from 2001, it's been more in the region of 3 months for churches to get it, even though we're doing a national tidal wave of survey forms. If a church does it at an outside time, it takes less than 2 weeks for them to get their results back. We've turned it around in 2 days, so it just depends how busy we are. So there's that moment. Then churches receive those results. As I said, it'll happen within less than 2 weeks for a church that's doing it now. So we have churches doing it all the time, and it'll happen within a couple of months. So we're thinking end of 21, churches will do it. They'll go have Christmas, have a holiday, they'll come back, and in the new year they'll have their results as they have their planning conversations for 21 and going forward. And denominations get results as well. I want to highlight that in particular in this. You've had a lot of input this morning from Mark and Ruth and Simon and our panel that I think stirs up a lot of thoughts. Now it's time to then say, what would be the outcomes that we want for our movement? We want to aim at helping churches have outcomes that are based on evidence, that decisions can be made from, that you have some confidence in. We want it to work at a denominational level, and we want it to work at a local church level. This is the important part of what we do. Not all the logistics, not the emails that shoot around, not all that stuff, not even the survey forms, okay? It's the outcomes. If it doesn't result in leaders feeling more equipped, if it doesn't result in leaders saying, this is going to help me do my job, okay? And if it doesn't result in denominational leaders like some of you saying, this is going to help me do my job. You've made my job easier because you've given me something that I didn't have to make myself or make up myself. You've given me a comparison with other denominations. You've helped me think about trends, and you've launched my churches into planning conversations they need to have. That's our aim. So that's what we want to do. We want to provide a solid research base. We want to provide that historical snapshot. We want that to continue on. We want the 7th wave in 21 to be as good as the others have been. And we want an opportunity to do research on issues that matter. So what are those issues? If you look at those 5 coloured things, they're broad areas that we talk about on our team. And we've comfortably sort of slotted most of what we do into those 5 broad areas. So what about church health? Where is that on your radar? And what part of church health? What about leadership? Effective leadership? Which are our leaders that are we think we've got to go and sit at their feet? They've got to teach our denomination something. They're doing well. What are you doing? Can we bottle it? You know who those leaders are in your movement? Some of you do. The NCLS has done an interesting job sometimes of bringing to light for a movement a leader no one knew really to listen to in their movement. I remember in one movement a church coming to light that had the highest newcomer levels in their region, and nobody knew. And they said, okay, we've got to go talk to this guy. What are you doing at your church? And it was one of the first really highly multicultural churches in that movement, and they had a completely different way of approaching how they did community in that church. So that's an area. That bigger picture of who's going to our church, what are their needs. The boring one, I made it grey because it's more boring, programs and systems. It sounds boring, doesn't it? But things like how many of our churches have a youth group? Now, some of you know that, but some of you don't, especially in the big movements. How big are those youth groups? Do they meet every week? What's the age group of that group? How many of us have children's ministries? How many have a children's minister? Unpaid, maybe if they're unpaid, we don't know about it centrally. There's a lot of questions you can ask, and part of what we do is take an audit of your region. So that's important. And then there's the church and society stuff, which we've heard so much about. So I'm going to ask you, again, to talk to each other, and here's the question for you. I want you to think about your world. For most of you, it's your denomination. For some of you, you represent a group today. You know, we've got people here from Alpha and church planning groups and things like that. So you might want to think about your local church, I don't know. But my question is, what are your most pressing questions in relation to church life? And my text was too small. So in the earlier session, I set up the back. So I was as far away from the screen. I made that text bigger so everyone could read it. So I hope you can read it. They are to stimulate your conversation. So can I just invite you, we're going to get you to talk to each other for a few minutes, and then we're going to pass this mic around because we'd love to hear if you're brave and you think, yeah, I don't think this is just us. I think this is an important thing to name in this moment. While there are 11 different denominations in the room, at least, that I know about. So I'll leave that on the screen, have a chat to each other for a few minutes, and then we'll call you back again. Thanks. Okay, well, we would like to know what your thoughts are. So, who's feeling brave? Ruth is going to take the microphone around, and you can pick any of those squares if one of them has really dominated your conversation, or maybe you've come up with something else that's really left field. Don't go to those people, Ruth. We'll stick with the main squares. But who would like to share a thought? And the reason for sharing the thought, I guess, is to name it as an important thing, either for your movement or you suspect wider. So if you share something, it may well be that others have shared the same thing again. So if you can catch Ruth's eye, then put your hand up and we'll share. This is Paul from Alpha Crucius. Yeah, I'm going to tell people who you are too if I happen to know. So
I'm an economist, so I guess I look at this with slightly different eyes. But I don't see anything about money there. And it's not just that you need money to do all the other stuff. It's that the church's attitudes to money, are really important for its engagement with society.
Yes. Yeah, and in that programs and systems box, that refers to a particular one per church survey that acts like an audit, and we do ask some money questions in there. But yeah, it's a big area. Yep.
Peter Overton, not the news reporter.
So where are you from, Peter?
I'm Far North Coast Presbytery, Casino, Kyogle and Upper Clarence
Uniting
areas,
Church.
not far from the fires, Uniting Church.
Yeah.
I think perhaps the word that I hit and I just talked with our group about was the word resilience. Okay. And it's a building capacity type word. And it's certainly in rural areas, and if you listen to Simon, you know, it comes around leadership, but I think it comes around governance and a lot of other areas. And then taking into account what Ruth was sharing regarding, you know, stepping out. I think resilience is one of the key issues in terms of the ageing demographic. What capacity do we have in leadership now?
Yes.
And planning for the future.
So resilience of leaders and of congregations.
And resilience in governance. Okay.
Yeah,
that's just a thought.
Thank you, Peter. That's good. I saw other people nodding. Keep trying. You'll get a eye eventually.
There we go.
Bishop Ivan Lee from Western Sydney.
G'day. You know everybody, don't you?
Yeah, most of you. Not everyone.
Yeah, look, for us, if I can speak on behalf of Sydney Anglicans, it is the left-hand bottom box, the leadership box, and not saying we're doing everything else really well, but if you had to pick one, where that's the big thing actually, and for us, I think we've got reasonable resilience and so on. So I'll pick the first dot point, which I can hardly... Effective leadership practices.
Yep.
Or being more effective leaders. Probably more than practices, but being effective leaders. And we have a lot of really well-intentioned people who come home from... We go to a lot of conferences, Sydney Anglicans, but we can't always make it happen when we're back, even though we're full of good intentions.
Yep.
We get tripped up and it doesn't happen in 12 months. We're not effective. So that's what we're working on, I think.
Okay, thank you. Yay, interrupted.
Fantastic. Yeah, Ying Ye from Chinese Christian Church. I think there are two issues that on my mind. I think one was the bottom left, effective leadership practices, but more specifically cross-cultural effective leadership practices. Mm-hmm. Because you find that in ethnic churches, you're going to have cultural differences in the way they think about leadership. Not to say one's right or wrong. So that's interesting, right? Yep. And I think the second one is who goes to church. You've got the intergenerational church, but tied up to that are the cultural, intercultural ones. Like, say, in the Chinese church, you have the first generation, second generation challenges, which are also tied up with intergenerational issues. So that's a very big, complex matrix to think through.
Yes.
It'd be interesting if you could do some great survey, and I'll take you out for coffee after that.
All right.
Thank you.
Sam?
Thank you. Simon Gillam from Moore College. We were all talking in our group about the leadership box as well, and particularly thinking about that idea of there's supervision, there's mentoring, there's coaching, there's lots of different kinds of relationships we encourage leaders into now. What difference is any of that making? Yep. So if we had a question that identified what leaders were doing in terms of getting input, ongoing input, and that could be correlated against how people felt about the leaders, how the leader was, whether the leader was being more effective or something like that. That could be really useful.
Absolutely. I see you're sitting next to Chris from the Coaching Network. So yeah, we've had some people involved in coaching come along, and Scott's here as well. So yeah, it's definitely a space that we know there's interest in. And obviously the area of supervision, professional supervision, that's becoming a compliance issue for denominations. And we've got maybe retraining of mentors to do, or other people who are obviously in trusted relationships already, but that's obviously huge on the agenda.
And a little quick, Michelle Lee, Morling College, to add to that, the idea of, one of the questions earlier for a church minister, do you think you're effective? Well, the other side of the coin is, does the congregation think the church minister is effective?
We asked that as well. Yeah.
Yes, as well. They may agree or they may disagree.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yep.
Actually, in fact, I will correct myself. We don't ask that as well. What we do is we measure how effective is this congregation on a whole bunch of, church health issues, because, yes, it is important to a leader's sustainability that they feel they're doing something effective, but we also want to, compare that to, well, how is this church going in different areas of church health? Yeah, both really important.
So
yes, Scott?
just to follow up, not only the coaching, the mentoring, the supervision piece, but also the other key input piece that the data says from the church planning space is intensives, so an intensive at the start of your church plant is effective. There's a lot of denominations and different groups putting in, more training into effective leadership. It'd be helpful as well to have something that says, have you done a course on leadership,
yes.
or have you done something like that? The other area as well, in the Geneva Push Church Planning Network, we do an annual marriage refresh. It's a 3-year program. It'd be great as well to see, like the Prezi denomination in New South Wales. I know they've had, John Mark ministry retreats, both for wives, husbands, and couples as well. It'd be interesting to see as well to, find out what inputs outside of coaching supervision, direct sort of training inputs and the impact on burnout, stress, longevity in ministry as well. All those sorts of things would be great to see.
Yes.
As well.
So that's that second point there. You can see sustainable leadership. So there's effective leadership and there's sustainable, and they're both important. Not just to talk about burnout and who's burning out, but who's thriving in ministry and how do we learn from those who are thriving. I'm going to keep going. Sorry, but there will be time later. So that's important. I want to show you another slide now. These are outcomes that we know denominations have been drawing from our work. Okay, and we want to continue to think, well, how do we do that more intentionally? So how do we support you in looking for how you do the best consultancies for churches? How do you assess new staff placements? We have some denominations that's just mandatory to use NCLS data to do that, because, how do you know who to place in a church if you haven't checked out, well, what's the culture of this church? What are its strengths and weaknesses? A survey like ours that surveys everybody is going to give you some picture of whether someone would be suitable. Funding applications, we have groups that use our data because they're going to government saying, well, I have evidence here for you about what our church or what our movement is doing in these communities. And I have ABS evidence that tells you what the need is in these communities. So we want to engage with you about that kind of thing over the next 18 months too. The longer the lead time, the better the quality of the work we can do, okay? How do we strategically resource local churches? And we've already just heard about ongoing training. Pastors go through college once, right? But there's ongoing training. There's need to keep up compliance issues or ongoing training. So how do we do that well? So there's a church process, but there's a denominational process that takes place as well. And we have to nail both those things, or you have to at least know both those things exist. What do I mean by a denominational process? Well, at a very simple level, you as a denominational leader should be able to quickly access what's going on for your churches, and that's what we provide for churches that have done the survey. So that's a very practical one. If you're travelling alongside some church leaders, then these sorts of results are available if you're authorised to do that. And we have some of you take great advantage of that, especially if you've got a movement that a lot of your churches have done it. We also produced some new work after the last survey, and I've just put up there some covers of some reports that we hadn't done before. And I want to mention some of those things. So one thing that we are doing more and more is talking to churches about where their different churches' needs are. So not all churches are the same, okay? There are different strengths and weaknesses. Some of you talk about the 3/3 of churches, the churches that don't need us in our movement. We're learning from them that they are the leaders in our movement, and they're fantastic, and they're even resourcing us to some degree. Then there's the middle third of churches. Quite often it's 3/3. This middle third of it really makes a difference how much we work with this group. This group, we can resource them and we can make a big difference as a denominational leadership. And then there's a third that might be struggling, that might need a great deal of resourcing, be asking for a great deal of resourcing, and there's a discernment issue as to which resources do they most need and how do we most bless them. Ruth talked in an earlier session about palliative care for churches, and it's such a sad term, isn't it? I actually heard a couple of people laugh at that term because you think, my goodness, but we've looked at change in Australia. If you don't change, if you don't adapt, you better hope you're in a Bible Belt, folks, because you cannot do church like you were doing 50 years ago if you're not in a Bible Belt. And there are churches that don't want to know that are great, warm, beautiful, loving communities, and we've been saying to churches, that's great, but it's not enough. One report that we did was that audit. So I told you there's a 1 per church survey that we did. It's not the one that the attenders fill out. It's one that a pastor or an administrator fills out. And here's a result for Australia that you can quote on Sunday if you're someone who gets up the front. 3/4 of churches in Australia in 2016 were offering material emergency relief to their local community. Okay? That's a food cupboard, or that's having Coles and Woolies vouchers, or something practical. I go to a church in Parramatta and we have a food cupboard and we need to ask regularly, folks, please come in and help us stock it up. It's being used every single week, multiple times, and by people who don't come to church. So that's the figure for the nation of churches. That's weighted data, so that really is, if we had got all the churches in Australia to do the NCLS, which they don't, that figure is pretty much simulating that. We are very confident it would be pretty much that figure, 3/4 of churches. But what is it for your denomination? So if you want to go to government, or if you want to assess where you're going, then we want to encourage you that we can resource you with that. And look down the bottom, 20% of churches, so 1 in 5 churches are now running migrant support activities of some kind. That surprised me that number was that high. If you're from Sydney or Melbourne, it might not surprise you because we're so incredibly multicultural. But more and more in rural areas, it's increasing as well, and there are many churches on the front foot. Here's another report that we did using the leader survey. So I'm just trying to open up your awareness of other things that we're doing. So I've heard, Ruth and I have both heard this morning, that leader survey stream is going to be one of our top priorities in the time going forward. We are already harvesting so much from that, but we want to make sure the next leader survey is relevant, and we recently added new questions on mentoring, and that I think we need even more. We need to ask about coaching and training. Have you done a course or things like that? But here's what we asked in 2016, and we've asked this for years gone by. How well trained do you feel? And so our church leaders feel very well trained in teaching and preaching, and 50% feel very well trained in mission and outreach. What do you think is the area of most need? It actually got raised by somebody else this morning. You know, it was a real standout. It was one of the findings this time around that I said, I think that's one of the most surprising and interesting findings. The area that leaders said, I don't feel equipped in this area at all, or I feel very poorly equipped, was cross-cultural ministry. And it's pretty much the same story in every denomination. It's 30% across Australia. A third of leaders, senior church leaders, are saying, I haven't got much here. And it's a felt need because Australia is changing. Many movements are saying, hey, it's our multicultural groups that are breathing new life into our movement. And so I would say if you're going to run one training this year, maybe it should be that. The other area was administration. I thought brown was a good colour for administration because it's boring, I know, but it's important because if leaders don't feel well trained in it, how are they going to feel about doing it? Here's another interesting graphic. This is an imbalance graph. It's not Australia. This is one particular denomination. Look at the percentage of leaders who think they do too much administration. Okay, it's a huge, huge issue. So if you don't feel very well trained to be an administrator and you're doing it as one of your top 3 things, how do you reckon that makes you feel about ministry and what you initially thought you were signing up for? So it's these issues. What is it in your movement? Look at the percentage of people who feel they should be doing more training. I'm not doing enough training of other people. You may be sitting there saying, but I want them to be doing training. I'm frustrated because more of that isn't happening. Here's local leaders in a movement saying, yeah, I want to be doing that too, casting vision, etc. So these are the sorts of outcomes that the leader survey can lead to. One last thing. We've done a lot of work over the years on sustainable leadership. So that was more about effective leadership we were just looking at. Sustainability, burnout, struggling, surviving, managing well, thriving. Every one of those dots on that picture is a senior minister in 2016 in Australia, and we wanted to just see how many are burning out. So what is it for your movement? What's the percentage of people who are really struggling, who are maybe not burning out but are at risk of that? So that's another area. If that's the area in your conversation, if you're having that conversation, that's something we're very concerned about, because you do NCLS anonymously. It's a safe place to acknowledge as a leader, and you may not be able to do that to your church people. You may not be able to do that to those who decide whether you've got a job, okay? But you can say to NCLS honestly whether you're doing well or not. And we're using validated scales. They're published in. We've helped develop some of these scales for international work, so it's quality work. So that was just all to say there is a denominational process. I want to finish by, I can't dwell on this now because we had a great discussion time and I thought that was more important, but there is a local church process as well. So hopefully the last few minutes you've gone, oh yeah, I didn't realise. If you're one of those movements that have not really used it to the full, you might have realised, oh, this could actually really make my job easier, because there are some groups that already know that. At the local church level, I want to say 4 things quickly. I think there's 4. A local church process should happen when NCLS happens. I did hear one person say this morning something I hate hearing, okay? They said, oh, our churches didn't really know what to do with the NCLS. So they did it, but they didn't get much out of it. That absolutely breaks my heart. The amount of money, the amount of time, the amount of effort, it's supposed to make a difference. So the first thing a church needs to decide is it going to be internal or external? Are they going to get outside help? Are they going to get a coach or a regional minister, or even just, he or she, the minister, is going to sit down with their mentor? How is it going? How are they going to make sure they get something out of this? Secondly, it should go through stages. So it's not like you fill out your form, you're like doing your census or, heaven forbid, your BAS form, and gosh, I never want to think about that again. You should be preparing your congregation, because the churches that talk to their congregation about this, guess what happens in that congregation? Those people feel listened to. Those people feel part of something. They say, I'm not a leader in this church, but I feel like I've got a voice into where this church is going. Guess what happens to a sense of investment in churches when that happens? So the NCLS is a rare moment when people feel they are all included and have a voice in where church is going. That, regardless of what the questions would be about, is a powerful moment. So you need to prepare well, you need to run it well, don't realise you've got no pens and go down and get the crayons out of the creche for the forms. You need to then, as a leadership, evaluate what are we seeing from these results. That should be the conversation that happens at leadership level. Then you want to communicate to church, and it should result in action. It should result in something. It doesn't have to take over, but at least the church should be saying, now as we plan for our next year, let's remember what we learned from our NCLS. We've got our plan, we've got our sense of call, but we learned in our last NCLS that we have an issue with community here. People don't have as strong a sense of belonging as we thought they did. So the plans we're making for the next year, how is that going to impact on community? So that'd be an example of how NCLS hasn't, those results haven't taken over, they haven't grabbed the steering wheel, but they have fed into the planning because there's important insights to be had. It should be targeted. Okay, we do whole sessions on this. I'm not even going to talk about them today. But there are things that matter in church life. That might not be your favourite list. That's fine. You can read our latest paper on everybody's favourite list, and you might discover some you didn't even know existed. We've got a new occasional paper out that compares us, NCD, Callaghan, and 20 other models. So, but what do you need to have a conversation about in your local church? That's the point of this. You can't talk about all of them. It needs to be targeted. So one church will say, we've looked at our NCLS, we have to have a conversation about faith sharing in our church because we've seen what those results told us. Another church will say, we have to have a conversation about leadership, or we have to have a conversation about worship. So there's different things happening in every church because it's targeted. You can't talk about them all. And lastly, it should be appropriate to the capacity of the church. So that's part of your role if you're a support person is, what is this church really ready to sign up for? What are they capable of? So I want to just, I'm looking at the time and I want to give people a chance to talk again. So can I ask you for a couple of minutes to ask yourself, just on the basis of what you've seen there, what are some of the ways that you would use resources? And this is not meant to be, this is not a sales session, right? We're 18 months out from the survey. This is an ideas session. I'm going to be emailing people. I want to hear the thoughts that have been generated because we're going to choose our course based on what you're talking about. So would you just take a moment to discuss that question with each other in the room, and then I'll call you back again. It seems right to finish by seeing if people have questions. If you have a question, and especially if your group has confirmed that question is very relevant, then there's probably other people in the room that have the same question. So, yeah, if you have a question and it's relevant to where we finish up today, and you think other people in the room have the same question, probably, would you ask that now, and we'll see if we can address it quickly in just the 5 minutes we have remaining. We'll just see if we can chase a few questions and then we'll finish.
Hopefully it's not tangential, but I'm a teacher in ministry and leadership in a Bible college or in a Christian college. How much of this will eventually morph into a degree or a diploma so that all your systems and everything that you have garnered over the years, it looks tremendous, all your skills, or is it outside the scope of today?
Well, no, we do go into colleges and give sessions. That's sporadic. So if you're talking about input, and we know many more colleges pick up our material and use it. Some of them have even, licensed stuff for every student, sort of like an electronic library of stuff. And we're breaking out more of a library facility now ourselves. So material, there's a wealth of material. If you go to our website, you can just search using a word, giving, multicultural, anything, and you'll get all the free fact sheets. You'll get the more substantial occasional papers, some of which are $8, I think, some of which are $30, and you'll get pointed to books. Many of you have books on the shelves that have come out as part of taking part. But yeah, there's possibility for more. Do you want to add to that, Ruth?
Yep, I think my response would be, that's up to you. If you're looking for a degree or something, I think it's untapped potential. So I'm looking at people from Alpha Crucis, UTC, Morling, Moore, etc. And I'm saying it's up to you. I think we've got a resource here with 1,000 PhDs ready and waiting to happen, 10,000 MAs, however many, you go for it, pick it, and we can work with you, and we'd love to do that. I think that's where we're up to in terms of our maturity and growth, is to take it into the colleges, but we'll need your help to do that. Love to talk with you. Yeah, and just as someone else put up their hand and Ruth will go to you, but just as Ruth does that, I notice a difference in the students I talk to now compared to 15 years ago. We used to go and do a session at Moore College once a year. The students now are so much more interested in data. We're in the information generation, well and truly, and they respect this stuff. It's actually not the younger ones that we need to convince of the need for evidence and for tracking things. It's the older ones that are going, oh, well, is this going to upset my pet theory if you give me some facts? So, yeah. Any other questions before we wrap up? Questions or comments?
Okay, you're either really tired or you've had excellent... Oh, good on you, Ian. Yeah, you had your hand up before. Ian, and then... Yeah, so Ian's from the Baptist, New South Wales. I hope you don't mind me saying that, Ian.
No, I'm proud to be a Baptist.
Okay, good on you.
And You can all join us if you'd like. We're one of the growing ones. I just had a question around, actually, particularly leadership was our big one before. So maybe 2 questions or comments. One around different styles of leadership, as we certainly, you know, there's a lot feeling ill-equipped, that getting trained to be, you know, a preacher, while good thing, it's saying we need more is what we're coming against. And we're certainly doing a lot more work in other types of leaders, like particularly around what we see in Ephesians, the 5-fold leadership gifts. So I don't know how you might be assessing that, or if that's possible. And the other question that we think is really closely connected to leadership is actually the disciples, leaders who make leaders. How can we assess the level of discipleship within our churches? For we're seeing that's a core function of churches that are thriving and doing well. They actually have very strong discipleship models that and commitments that are generational. You know, that go across a long period of time. Starting the younger they start the disciple, the more leaders they're producing into the future. And they tend to be thriving churches.
Thank you, Ian. Ruth, I think we need another new book on leadership, hey? Well, our last book on leadership came out in 2009. That's we had Lead With Your Strengths. And you'll see some really interesting stuff in there if you haven't seen it. But we have a huge amount of material that has only come out in a fact sheet here or there, and some that isn't published. So I'm hearing some real appetite for that. So thank you for that. Richard from the Lutherans. Thank you, Richard, for being here.
This is more directed to Ruth. The whole area of families, the impact of parents passing on the faith, as you know, I think worldwide has been documented, of those who are in the church, because that's often. But I'd be interested to look at how much families have had a negative impact in some ways on people who are not in the faith, because the people not in the faith is a completely different group of people. Like I've got one or two stories where I've said to somebody, "Oh, how come you're not coming to church?" And they said, "You don't know how my parents act." So that's an area I think could help us in the church, but I'm not quite sure how we research that.
Yeah.
Okay, so our focus today was on the 2021 National Church Life Survey, which is obviously coming inside the churches and listening to the leaders and the attenders inside. Sounds like you're looking for something which is a community survey or community focus groups or something like that. So we'll take that on notice for our next community survey. You can tell this one was all about inviting, you know, what would you come to, all the rest of it. But we're going to track our community surveys every year, so we'll take that on notice for that one. Can I also just mention one innovation we're thinking about for 2021? I'll come out the front again. Just quickly, is we're playing with the idea of a community contact survey where you do a church life survey with the attenders and the kids and leaders and everybody. You do an audit, but we also have in the bag a draft of a community contact survey where the church hosts it and invites people who are coming at least to the play group, the men's shed, all of those community things that you're doing, and inviting them to reflect on not only what they think about that activity, but their own faith journey, etc. So if you're interested, we're going to have another crack at that one, we hope, in 2021. I'm getting some nods. All right, Sam? There we go.
That's good. Yep. So we're in the era of the smartphone now, and we feel its time had not come 10 years ago. But we feel that some churches benefited, but we think a lot of, and we've heard in the other cities too. We were in Brisbane last week, Melbourne the week before, and real interest in that one. Folks, we need to finish if I keep my promise. So is it okay if we wind up? And you don't have to go. There's tea and coffee. There's some leftovers there. So somebody ate all the vegan food, and I don't think it was the vegans. So, you know, have a bit of, leave that one vegan thing, please, if they're still there. But can I finish with just praying for us? Because we've got over 10 denominations in the room today. That's a rare moment. And let's just acknowledge our God and close in prayer. Our Father God, we acknowledge that we all want the same thing, and we want to be guided by you in that. So make us wise through your word, through your spirit, through what reality is telling us. Help us to open our eyes. Thank you, Lord Jesus, that you said you will build your church. We look to be your instruments, and we thank you for the privilege and the blessing of being on this mission under your direction and guidance. So we pray for each other. We pray for a blessing over our nation as we represent so many denominations and local churches. We pray, Lord, that you would guide us and lead us for your glory. And we pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for being here, folks.